so much for sharing. We will be recording this session as an opportunity to share the recording afterwards with those who are either unable to attend or who would like to reference it on the Market Links webpage. Just a kind note that you can always access the closed captioning for today's session by clicking the link on the screen or inputting that link into your web browser, or you may enable it directly into your Zoom platform by clicking the More buttons and then enabling closed captioning, transcript, or subtitles. Okay, my friends, hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to begin our session today. So with that, thank you for inputting your name, your organization, and where you're joining us from in chat, and also to responding to those welcome polls. At any time throughout today's session, you can go ahead and access that chat bar and let us know if you do have any questions for our presenters. We will begin the session today with Laura Meissner. She will be our moderator for today's session. Laura is a Senior Economic Recovery and Market Systems Technical Advisor seconded by the University of Arizona to support USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. So let's begin this session. Laura, over to you.
Thank you so much, Janina. Can everybody hear me well? Hopefully.
Yes, we hear you clearly.
Excellent, thank you. So good morning or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. We are so grateful that you've chosen to spend some time learning with two amazing partners. Speaking from USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, as most of you probably know, humanitarian needs have really risen dramatically in recent years. For this year, 2021, they're estimated at $35 billion. Donor funding simply cannot keep pace. At the same time, of course, the private sector has long been a major source of funding for and the engine of job growth. Official government assistance to lower income countries is just dwarfed by private flows. And about 90% of jobs in the developing world are created by the private sector. USAID and other donors need to find ways to close that gap between needs and available funds. And partnering with the private sector to adopt context-sensitive, market-based approaches, scale those for impact, and then support innovation is one way to do this. This can, of course, be particularly tricky in fragile and conflict-affected environments where thin markets, a lack of market information, challenges in infrastructure and technology, governance challenges, and more can pose barriers to taking up these approaches. So we're very lucky to be joined today by representatives from two agencies supported by USAID, the Pan American Development Foundation, or PADF, in Haiti, and ASILI, which is a partnership between ALIGHT, formerly known as the American Refugee Committee, and Eastern Congo Initiative, a social enterprise. If you would like to learn more after today about how to engage the private sector in fragile contexts, I'm pleased to announce that USAID earlier this month released a primer on how to do just that through the Feed the Future Market Systems and Partnerships activity, and informed by experiences from BHA, among other parts of USAID and our partners. You can find it at the link showing on your screen. Now I would like to introduce our speakers. Our first presenter today will be joining us from the Eastern Congo Initiative. They are Valerie Namuto, a regional director, and Tad London, the project manager. Valerie manages every aspect of ECI's field operations. From day to day, he coordinates the entire Asili enterprise, from counting cash at water points to negotiating rights of way with local leaders. Beyond his work for ECI, he is in fact renowned throughout the country for his skill as a pianist and composer, including playing for the president in Kinshasa. He lives and works in Bukavu, a city he loves for its culture and its Art Deco architecture. Tad directs the design, development, and operation of ECI services and products, which serve over 120,000 people every day. He leads the development of Asili, a social enterprise providing water and health facilities in Eastern Congo. Tad has been working there since 2014, when he joined the light for just a few months, but Congo stole his heart and he has fallen in love. We will also hear from Soumya Krishnamurthy, who is the Director of Partnerships and Sustainable Finance at PADF. She joined them in 2014 in their Port-au-Prince office, and she now oversees private sector partnerships and sustainable finance investments for all of PADF. She has experience in entrepreneurship, workforce training, local governance, environmental sustainability and disaster response, as well as innovative financing, local enterprise development, public-private partnerships, value chain development, and promoting market-based approaches. She previously worked at the Fortune Magazine Group, for Time Inc., at the Clinton Bush Haiti Fund. She has a bachelor's degree from Hollins University and a law degree from Duke University. She will also be joined by Cédric Jean-Louis, who is PADF's Haiti Country Director. Cédric joined PADF in 2014 as well. She's a senior executive with over 25 years of financial, administrative, and organizational development experience. She has worked on everything from startup operations, change management, developing financial systems, security assessment, and policy. She holds an MBA from Eastern University and a bachelor's degree from the Institut National d'Administration de Gestion des Hautes Études Internationales in Haiti. If you have any questions during these presentations, we would ask that you please write them in the main chat box. We are allowing plenty of time during this webinar to address them during the Q&A portion. I would now like to hand it over to Tad and Valerie to get us started. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to everybody today. It's something that's to our hearts of really how do we take private solutions and be applying them to this this new kind of geographies and demographies to really create better outcome for everybody using business as the way forward on that. So if we go to the next slide, please. Great, thank you. Sorry, my internet might be a little bit unstable, so I shut off my video. But really what we're trying to do with Asili is to take the notion of aid and see how do we start to use that to reinvent aid and transform it into startup capital for businesses. And so the idea really is, I think something that we all are is kind of this cycle of when there is a big crisis or there is a big shock that comes into a place. A lot of humanitarian aid will flow in, things will start to stabilize, and then there'll be a slow transition into development work. Sometimes and so what we want to do is, okay, let's the beginning, and let's really think with the end in mind of how do you use one of these crises as an opportunity to start building up systems and infrastructure and enterprises and put those into place so that then you can create ongoing support and service delivery models that continue to work for customers during times of crisis, but also as they transition out of crisis and into development. So how do we really span that gap? And so for us, the number one way that we did that was we really wanted to say, okay, let's take that philanthropic investment, let's put that into building out the infrastructure businesses. And if we kind of erased that from the balance sheet, it allowed us to then focus in on specifically the operational costs, which allowed us to then be a much more affordable for our customers, while also ensuring that we had higher levels of quality. And Valerie's going to talk a little bit about the approach on that.
Thank you, Tad. Yes, then after those 3 points mentioned by Tad, so the approach is to see now where to start and how do we want to start. So we choose the human-centered design, and that was a process we used to implement the program. And we meet several communities identified in the program and see what is the real need on the ground, and to learn about what support we can give to the community. And then during those sessions with the community, we found that the real need was in healthcare, access to water, and economic growth. So the question was, okay, if we can start by those 3 components, how do we implement them, and how do we create some kind of different things which will last and will be helpful for the community. And then for that, we choose like doing those activities, but creating a kind of business model which will help the aid to last for long. Yeah, so next slide, please.
Yeah, and so what we've actually ended up doing is taking these businesses that Valerie was mentioning, so healthcare, primary healthcare and preventative healthcare, clean water distribution networks, and then economic growth or economic generation opportunities, and putting those all together in what we call a zone. And so the idea being that those are basic needs that people have within the community, and that if we can kind of pull all of those levers at the same time, we'll create more resilient, healthier, and more economically empowered communities. And we started that through this iterative model. And so we currently have 6 of these zones operating, serving about 120,000 customers every day. And we're on track to expand into a total of 10 zones to serve 500,000 customers. And so you'll see they're largely clustered around the city of Bukavu. And now what we're doing is really seeing, okay, how do we work also on the management tools and techniques in collaboration with some private sector partners as well, to grow further afield while ensuring that we can maintain quality as we go. Please go ahead to the next slide. Oh, Valerie, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So I was saying, as all those things are now put together, the question was, what kind of impact do we expect to have from the community? And then we put those 3 components, and we discovered that there was a kind of need for the community to have a package of services given together, and then that can empower the community. We discovered that also on the ground that the 95% of the community can be able to access to the services, because we found that if we can provide those services to 95% of the community and have those services affordable and accessible and high quality developed, that will push the community to kind of being ready to sustain those activities. So we also discovered those kind of new components, as I can say, the affordable and clean energy, which is a new services we want to put together to add to the existing services, so that we can have a package and create a membership where the community can have access to those 3 component of the services on the same time, so that we can have a community more resilient and economically empowered communities. Next slide, please.
Each one co-locate those businesses. So within each one, 7 water points. And for us, it was also important to start who's in those systems and how do we make sure we have staff there are really members of the community, speak really to people in a way that's going to, the values are going to be translating over to them, right? So one of the things that we really like within this model is that, you know,
Hi, Tad. Your audio is cutting in and out. Is there any opportunity, Valerie, we can ask you please to just speak a little to this slide? I believe we might have lost Tad's audio.
Yeah,
hey, I'm back now.
Oh, there
about
he
that.
is.
Let me try and cut my video though again.
Okay.
Always fun, right, with internet challenges. So one of the main reasons though that we chose business is that what we were really doing is seeing how do we make something that's not accountable to the donor, but actually to the end user, right? And so what we're able to do is we're one of the, what I would say is one of the few USAID programs, humanitarian programs, that has no beneficiaries. We only have clients. And as soon as someone becomes a client, or then you become we're able to see that in our sales records every week. How are people doing? How are people understanding the value that we're bringing to the community, and what is our value proposition? And so within that, we've also then really put a huge focus on making sure that even though we're a co-creation between different Congolese organizations and US organizations, and of course USAID itself, that as many of our staff as possible and everyone on the front line is Congolese. And so currently we've got over 110 employees, 3 of which are not Congolese. But the idea really is that as we start to create these jobs and within these zones, and also give people consistent, affordable access to these basic services, that the quality of life will continue to improve. Next slide, please. So, you know, all of that sounds great, but we wanted to actually, you know, we've been doing this since 2014. And so we thought it would make sense to share some of the ways that we've really kind of fallen flat on our face, and the ways that we've had to pick ourselves up and iterate and change on the way. So please go ahead to the next slide.
Well, when it comes to change, I mean, to shift from beneficiary to clients, we thought about how do we provide the highest quality of the services, because we believe that as soon as we're talking about client business and other things, and then we thought that we could be bringing from board a container. You can see the container on the down right. That was the prefabricated container. We brought that container to the community. And then we knew that as soon as the container will reach the city, I mean the community, will already start activities. And then it's become a very high level of challenge to bring the container from aboard to the community where we want to serve. It was a very rural area. There was no road for access, and it took longer to bring the container. And then the other thing is that when the community was seeing the container, they knew that the services will be there for very short time, because they found that the container will be moved as it came. So we start learning from that, and realize that it could be very helpful and meaningful that we can change from the container and to build now a real clinic with concrete, and as you can see on the photo, the clinic is a building where community can have access, and that bring the community at the level of being comfortable and trust, so that they can say, oh, we are paying for the service and the service will stay for long. Next slide, please.
Great. And just to clarify a few questions I'm seeing coming in too. So these are businesses, right? And so when we talk about clients, those are individual families or families or individuals, as well as other businesses that are coming to purchase water from the water points. So when we talk about within the zone, we have 7 of those. What we do is we capture one source, and then we build a distribution network that goes throughout a village or several villages. And now we're actually operating in peri-urban and urban areas around the city of Bukavu. But as operating as a business, one of the things that we really did learn is that if you're trying to do everything and trying to do too much and not specialize, you'll end up doing nothing for anyone. And so one of our very early experiences was, we've talked about how we bring all 3 of these businesses in at the same time. And so one of the first experiences that we had within rural markets was selling seeds and fertilizer on credit to farmers, as well as giving them a forward purchase contract to then buy the end product of potatoes, Irish potatoes, and turn around and then sell those in the city. So we're kind of an aggregator as well as increasing the inputs there. And what we ended up realizing is that there's a reason that there's companies that just specialize in agriculture, right? It's actually very challenging, especially with such low margins and low levels of data that are available to understand who's going to be a good farmer and who's not. So one of the very difficult decisions that we had to make was to divest from that agriculture business and actually turn that over to more philanthropic-based partners that could continue that on. But now the big lesson for us there was, this was still a very important part of our model, was to really look around and see, okay, who are the people that have a business that's currently running? And how do we bring them onto our platform in order to continue that work of increasing the demand within the communities for social services? And so what we ended up doing was we ended up inviting on companies like Nespresso into communities that were growing coffee, so that they could purchase the coffee from these communities. And at the same time, they were funding the infrastructure. So the cash needed to build out the water system and build out the clinic, so that they could also be delivering social services to the farmers at the same time through us. And so one of the big lessons that we've come away with is, really focus in on what your niche is, and then find other people that can collaborate and can complete other partners or other areas that you want to continue to operate in. So next slide, please. And then I think one of the bigger challenges or bigger lessons that we've had is that as we were looking at this, particularly kind of from the outside and seeing what had been happening in Congo for, at that point, 20 years of aid flowing in, projects coming, and then at the end of a project, it was really hard to see the results continuing once the donor financing stopped. Was that we really had to radically change the way that we thought about standards. And so what we ended up doing was creating a very simple standard, which was that if it wasn't a service that was good enough for any one of us as employees, any one of our donors, whether that be people from USAID, private sector partners, anybody really on the face of the planet, then it wasn't going to be good enough for Congolese communities. I think that very oftentimes within the humanitarian or development sector, when you're working in a complicated place like Congo, it's easy to let the feasibility challenges, right? The challenges of how hard the operating environment is, cloud the vision on what is doable. And so we set a very, very high standard. And then we've challenged ourselves to stick to that day in and day out, even during the time of COVID, where our water system continued to operate every single day, even when there was the shutdowns. Our clinics continued to see patients. And we're actually, despite the economic challenges that came with that, we're able to see an increase in revenue across all of the businesses. And we really think that that has to do with this idea of, you know, when you are no longer seeing yourself as a project, but seeing yourself as an enterprise that exists to serve the community, you're bringing a respect to the community that then they're also echoing back. And so it's really been this great partnership that we've had with all of the different villages that we're operating in and the city that's changed kind of really changed the face of these areas of Bukavu right now. So those are three of our big takeaways from this. We want to make sure we have plenty of time. I know there's a lot of great questions, but we want to make sure that we have time for the other partners to talk as well. So we'll turn it over to you guys. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Great. Thank you so much, Tad and Valerie. We really appreciate it. Now we are going to turn from Eastern Congo to Haiti with Soumya and Cedric. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you, Tad and Valerie. You're a tough act to follow. Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm just going to be briefly on camera because even though I'm in Washington, D.C., I have internet connectivity issues as well, but it is so nice to see all of you. I'm going to talk today, both Cedrel and I are going to speak today about our experience with private sector engagement in the context of disaster and disaster risk reduction in Haiti. We wanted to reflect on our contrasting experiences when we can take the time to think through private sector engagements, build on relationships, which we typically get in a disaster risk reduction program, as opposed to when speed and accuracy are very much the writing criteria when we're in a post-disaster context and we're transitioning maybe from relief and response to early recovery. And so I wanted to start us off today. I don't know about all of you, but my coffee hasn't quite kicked in, and nothing like a good music video from Haiti to get everybody on their feet, right? So if you don't mind going to the next slide, please, and getting us started with the video. Could we move to the next slide, please? And could we load the video? Okay, I guess we can't. Sorry, I can't do justice. I can't actually break out in song and dance. Oh, there we go.
Thank you, Soumya. Give us just one moment while we pull it open.
Sure.
Thank you.
Lave men nou, chak lè nou fin joué. Lave men nou, avan nou manje. Lave men nou, lèm fin fè bezwen nou. Te ou sot nan latrin ou bien toilet hygienik. Toujou lave men nou. Si moun repete. Voye nou an batè, pa fè bezwen nan tèt sousyo. Respekte prinsip hygienik yo, ti moun chande. Lave men nou, lave, chakè nou fin lave. Lave men nou, lave nou manje. Lave men nou, lèm fin fè bezwen nou. Ken sot kalate nou, gen toilet hygienik. Toujou lave men nou. Bravo ti moun.
Mesaj sa, se yon koutwazi, program Upgrade, ki jwen support USAID OFDA, PADF, Ministère Éducation Nationale, Ministère Santé Publique, DINEPA, Mairie Port-au-Prince ak Mairie Wanamen.
Thank you for making that work. So I wanted to start us off there to first broaden the idea of private sector engagement. What you saw in that is a video from our disaster risk reduction program Upgrade that ran for a few years in the communities of Port-au-Prince, Martissan, and then also in the north in Wanamint. And I wanted to point that out because the musician you saw is a famous Haitian musician, Bik. And we wanted to broaden the idea of private sector. It is firms, it is both local firms and national firms, it's regional firms, it's the international private sector. But it's often also individuals that have a lot of influence, and private sector engagement, to be truly successful in our experience, sits within an ecosystem of partnerships. And we wanted to just highlight some of the things that different partners bring to the table. And I'm going to come back to the point about donors pushing us to be more creative in our solutions later on in the presentation. But that, you need to have the government, you need to have diaspora, you need to have media companies, and sometimes you need to be creative in how you think through these partnerships, because the fact that we had big kind of lead the message delivery and the content around this really upped the reach, and we just had such a great reception from this video. So I'm just going to just put that idea there, as the idea of different partnerships and how they weave in and out has mattered a lot to the success and impact of our private sector engagement. Next slide, please. I'm going to shift gears a little bit now to talk about post-Matthew recovery. And I know there are a lot of folks in the audience today who've also participated and sometimes even led how the donors and implementers responded to Hurricane Matthew. I particularly want to call out Catholic Relief Services. We worked adjacent to them in our work. But the goal here in this program was to make sure that the most affected families after the hurricane just devastated many parts of the south of Haiti in 2016, to demonstrate that it really mattered what materials were used, what construction techniques were used, because as we all know, the natural event contributes, but it's often the faulty construction or the lack of resources and lack of knowledge that leads to devastating impact. And if we took that idea, a safer home, to be the center of our focus, we engaged the private sector and also the local ecosystem in creative ways. The first thing was we knew we needed to be very quick in our response. These communities had suffered so much. So for the very first time, rather than doing our traditional assessments, which were often having teams down on the ground, we used drones and GPS mapping to sort of do large scale assessments, and then followed that up with a few more on-the-ground engineering visits. That helped us have a bigger picture and also generated great interest from local actors as to what activities we were planning to do. And that led directly to engagement with local universities and local technical schools. We drew upon engineering students, we paired them up with our own team of engineers, and we started engaging local builders, all of that even at the assessment phase. The next step for us was making sure that there were higher quality materials that were available. And this is an important point because the local market, while vibrant and definitely had supply chains and distribution points that we wanted to leverage, was simply responding to market conditions on the ground. These were poor communities and they weren't demonstrating the purchasing power that was needed for the vendors to stock the requisite materials. Our program, of course, came in designed to stimulate some demand around this and also awareness and knowledge as to why these things mattered. But we were distorting the market and we were aware of that going in. So we chose local vendors carefully. We introduced, we helped them source the materials we wanted them to have in supply for our beneficiaries. And then we also drew in larger enterprises from Port-au-Prince. Particularly, we worked with the company called Transversal to do vouchers so that people could know exactly what materials they were eligible to buy. The vendors knew who were able to purchase these materials and knew exactly how much inventory they were going to move. It gave some certainty to the business operations in a time of great uncertainty and risk. And then we engaged local builders. Obviously, you want to build capacity and knowledge within communities, and you also want to build upon their own practices. You want to see what materials they usually go to, what choices they make, and how we can work around those choices. We used e-vouchers, as I described below, but that also came with some challenges. Network connectivity is not always the best. The vendors that we had chosen did not have necessarily the equipment needed to process the vouchers, but we knew that the vouchers were very critical to us because, like I said, we wanted to be fast in our response, we wanted to be transparent, and we wanted to be accountable. And then one final extra layer that we added, and this was entirely thanks to the directive and the creativity of the donor, which was USAID and OFTA in this case, or formerly OFTA, now BHA, was the idea that to really spur recovery, these communities could really benefit from connections to power. And as luck would have it, an NGO, a partnership of an international NGO and a local company had started building solar microgrids in some of the communities we were working in. And the hurricane had obviously caused great damage to the one grid they'd already built and put on hold the other grid that they were working on. And so we came in to help support rebuilding of the first grid, ensuring the second grid was up and running, and then that the connections could be made not just to individual homes, but also to some of the community facilities and infrastructure like street lamps, etc. So this now, by engaging the private sector and then by broadening the notion of the private sector, so we've talked about local builders, we've talked about local vendors, we've talked about suppliers of materials, we've talked about a power company off-grid, and we've talked also about a national firm coming in to provide some of the backbone infrastructure of the voucher. This broad net of private sector actors really enabled us to deliver a rapid response, a high quality response. But where I think we reflected on this was once our endeavor is done, which of these private sector actors remain embedded in the community? Which of them will continue to offer the services that we had engaged them to do? And how would their relationship with these communities evolve over time? So some of them, there was built-in sustainability. We take a look at the microgrid, and that was exactly what they needed to, what the support that we gave was exactly what they needed in order to kickstart their business operations. And so there is a high level of likelihood that they'll continue to provide services. And then actually in the earthquake that just happened recently, their infrastructure survived and they were able to resume operations. But in the case of the materials and the vendors, while a lot of awareness was raised and people whose roofs were repaired with these materials and with these techniques are very happy with the results, and they're well equipped to survive future high category storms. The vendors simply don't have the necessary incentives to in place to continue to stock those materials unless there is demand. And those communities need to increase their purchasing power. So the hope is that when you bring a multitude of services, you think about, well, will these things lead to better income streams over time? And will they then translate the knowledge that they have that these materials are good, that the right techniques have to be in place to actually translate into demand and buying decisions. The local builders and their awareness of the techniques, use of things like roof trusses and hurricane straps, that knowledge exists and continues to inform their practice. And maybe it's going to be adapted back to the materials that are more easily available, but some of those techniques will survive, and we believe that'll have a lasting impact. In the case of the electronic vouchers, there is really no reason for vendors to continue to use them, so that was a short-term activity. But some of the things around customer service and teaching the vendors about the importance of talking to homeowners about the materials and quality of materials, and driving sort of decisions towards higher quality materials wherever possible, that knowledge and decision making and awareness remains. And finally, the homeowners themselves. I think we received a lot of great feedback about how safe they felt, how they could visibly see the difference, and that they realized that these things, there was active participation when they went to the store. They were the ones who were making choices about many of the things that were being bought, and they felt very empowered and informed in their decision making in a way that they maybe hadn't been before. So this was the sort of landscape of private sector engagement in a very difficult post-disaster context. And I would say for the purposes of our project, these were good decisions, and we were happy. But for the long term, for the sector as a whole, for us to think about how can we build in even more sustainability and think through how can our interventions reduce the distortions in the market or be short-term, have short-term effects. Next slide, please. Now, disaster risk reduction activities are in contrast, give you really the room to develop much more long-term partnerships, to really get to know your partners in and out, to understand their business models, to be able to support the evolution of their business models, and to ensure that there is long-term continuity, that you're working very much alongside the market, that your distortions are minimal, if at all, and that you also have more of a roster of partners. You have the luxury of time, if I can say that, to think through building that roster out, and then really tailoring each partner's strength and thinking through additionalities. You also have the time to iterate. I think our Tad and Valerie pointed this out too. You're never going to land correctly. Well, not never, but you're unlikely to land on a perfect solution from the very beginning. So a DRR program or any long-term program allows you to sort of think through that and innovate and continue to design to a perfect solution. In this case, in the program upgrade, we actually knew that water and sanitation, and particularly sanitation marketing, was an important part of our activities. And we had been working with a local company called Glory, which wanted to manufacture local toilet paper, but really catered their marketing and their market segment to very vulnerable communities. So when we were doing DRR activities, they were a great partner for us. They thought of it as a great way to expand their own reach and market share. So they came in and designed floats around awareness around sanitation and hygiene. They were an active part of the video that we put together that you saw earlier. They created jobs in the community just by the fact that we had opened up access to them. And those activities and those supply chains and those distribution models and those income generations have continued long after our program has ended. And so I think this really for us brought home again the point that DRR programs are extremely critical just in terms of making communities more resilient, but they're also really critical because businesses have greater expectations and greater returns out of partnering with us with something like this, because we work with their business models as opposed to taking their services and shoehorning them into something that we're designing for different results. And I just wanted to stop here, and I'm sure this resonates with many of your experiences in the field as well, thinking through disaster response and disaster risk reduction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sonia. I think those were two excellent presentations.
Back on over to you, Laura.
Okay, thank you. Anyway, yes, so thank you to both of you. We do have about 15 minutes for questions, and thank you to those of you who have already put questions in the chat box. Please feel free to keep doing so. I know for some of the questions, the presenters have answered them in the chat, so I especially appreciate that. I'd like to put a question out maybe to both organizations, to ECI and PADF. One is that both of you mentioned challenges in infrastructure, including electricity, technological infrastructure, and as we know, this is a common challenge in a lot of fragile contexts. Are there any advice or lessons that you might like to offer to other programs that are facing these same challenges? Anybody who would like to start either side?
I can take a stab at it. Oh,
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Sonia.
Sure. Yes, I think these challenges exist, and I think the pandemic has demonstrated very clearly the huge digital divide that exists, not just between countries, but also within communities within countries. But I would say the counterpoint is that communities have great workarounds in many cases. They also have ideas around ways in which they want to engage, and even in a disaster response context, it was important to work with the existing actors as much as possible. So Transversal, the company that we highlighted for the vouchers, had worked with many communities in Haiti. They knew the constraints of the infrastructure. They were able to help us design something that would work within the context of the infrastructure in the south. The EarthSpark, the grid provider, was a startup and had many lessons learned, even in the year or so that they had been working on the grid before we got there. And again, I think they were in it for the long term, so we were able to lean into their own assessments of the market and work with their knowledge as opposed to coming in and telling them how they should rethink their business model. Over to you, Ted.
Yeah, thanks. For us, yeah, and I think this kind of goes back to that scale can be not the same as substance for us. Is that as we were beginning, particularly on the building out this system, we were really thinking about, okay, what are all of the tools that you need to have in place, right? So we put a lot of money and time and energy into building technology systems and solutions. And frankly, they all just fell flat right on their face and did not work. And so what we actually ended up doing was scrapping all of those and going back to paper systems, going back to just really letting people understand, okay, what is the role of these? What is the value that they're bringing in terms of capturing receipt information, capturing different data collection points that we need to operate as a business. And I'll say probably the number one most important piece of technology that we've brought into the business has just been checklists. And so now we've created checklists for kind of every step of what you need to do along the business. And that's how we can help drive things towards a brand standard. And that's actually something that came from one of our private partners, Target, which is a large retail chain within the US. And one of the things that we really liked was that anytime you go into a Target, you know it's a Target. It feels different than a Walmart, let's say. And we said, okay, what's the deal here? How do you do that? And it came down to something simple like a checklist. And so we really did just focus on that first. And we said, okay, we ran that first clinic for a year, developed those really lo-fi checklists, went to another clinic, right? Ran that for another year before we expanded to our third. And now we're able to slowly increase the cadence of that. And now that we have these other systems in place, we're now able to go back and say, okay, where is it appropriate to inject technology into our business process? So now we've developed our own clinic management system. By the end of this year, we'll be launching our own digital water management solution as well. But was first really working with our end users, in this case, who are our own staff, right? These are largely men and women from the village that have only ever worked in the informal economy, and got them to understand really what is that process first, and then digitize that after doing several iterations on how we can make that process work in Congo. Over.
Thank you so much to both of you. I like that takeaway that sometimes it's better to just start with a paper rather than to try and have the fancy digital solutions first. I'd like to pose a question now to PADF. There was a question about understanding, of course, that the programs that you were presenting have finished now, but if you wanted to speak to any adjustments to your current programming due to COVID or due to the political crisis that's taken place in Haiti over this last year, and how that might have affected having a private sector engagement approach.
Yeah, I can say that this is a bit difficult. I mean, the situation that we are currently facing in Haiti now. But first of all, in terms of COVID, we try to reduce, the type of meeting that we used to have. We have mostly virtual meeting, and also each time we have to visit the community or have some kind of meeting or work relation with the community. So we respect the distance and have people, sitting somewhere where we can respect the distance between them. But in terms of for the fighting gang, I know that is a very concern for everyone. But one thing that we have done is we engage, people from the community. So we build kind of ownership. So they are part of the program that we are implementing. Let's say that we need some facilitator or someone that can lead the process. We try to find someone who is qualified inside the community so they can have people, get inside when we have some problem. But for sure, sometimes we put on hold some activities, but most of them, we can say that we are currently implementing. And even we anticipate some delay, but we have been able to work so far in some, very hard community.
Thank you so much, Pedro. I really appreciate that. Now a question for ECI. There are quite a few questions about sort of how Asili works and what the business model is. How do you set prices? What is the USAID funding for? What do you do with the revenue? What's your exit plan? Would you, either Valerie or Chad, want to take a moment to kind of clarify ECI's status as a Congolese-owned business?
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question, right? And it's one that's a little bit different than I think a lot of other approaches. And that's that ECI is essentially like a holding company for us. It's something that allows us to facilitate the relationship with USAID, but Asili is something that exists kind of within its own right as its own structure. And so people often, particularly when we're in Bukavu, when we're first setting up, people say, okay, like, well, but when does Asili leave, right? We always say, well, we'll leave as soon as Coca-Cola leaves, right? Like we've got the same exit plan as them. As long as people want to buy our services, then we want Asili to exist. And so I think it's a little bit of a different mindset shift, right? Of rather than being this project-based approach, what we're really trying to do is use the USAID-funded project so as that will continue to operate well after the period of grant funding. And so we're actually on our second GDA. So that's the funding mechanism that we use. But the first 4 clinics and water systems that we built under the first GDA with USAID are continuing to operate without any further philanthropic funding. So the phase that we're in now is to actually expand our retail footprint. So add on these zones until we get to 10, which in our financial projections will then get it so that not only are all of the frontline costs of the clinic, so the staff, the maintenance of the clinic, the equipments and medicines and outreach and all of those things are covered, as well as for the water system, but also those corporate costs that are in Bukavu. So our brand management team, our medical officer that reviews, the quality of cases, our finance and HR teams, all the things that you need to run a business, right? We'll be growing to 10 zones because then that should cover all of those costs. And so with that, then the 10 zones will continue to operate without any further philanthropic funding, except for there's 5% of the population that cannot afford the services. And so we use targeted philanthropy to subsidize their access to the services. And we don't subsidize the business, we subsidize them using the services, which is a distinction. And that's one just quick thing I'll add is that we really use that because, and we've used this model to show that it is possible. What we're hoping is that as we then have this stable platform, is that then we'll be able to look at different types of financing in order to then grow more quickly with market-based financing as well. Over.
Thank you so much. I think we have about 1 more minute, so I might test how fast you can both talk. But perhaps to both of you, and maybe Sejal and Sonia first. Both organizations talked about the need to pivot and knowing when to walk away when something's not working. Is there any last advice that you would love to share with the audience about how to know when to do that, or have the courage to do that, or how to be realistic but still ambitious in your targets? Over to you, Sonia and Sejal, and then to Valerie and Ted.
Yeah, I think that is something that we all have to be cognizant of. I think, and I also think private sector engagement never really starts and stops, regardless of whether individual programs or projects do. So you're always wanting to be aware of key actors in the landscape. You are wanting to keep up with the longstanding institutions. You're wanting to promote new technology, and I think in all of that we have to recognize that the market is much more tolerant of failure maybe than we are. It allows room for iteration and allows room for course correction. And also the market is never static. So I think all of these things make it easier to think of when a particular path or a partnership doesn't quite work the way it does, and not intending to shift blame, but really thinking about it as a true partnership, thinking about the end user experience and being willing to make room for more people to come in and sharing lessons learned like this.
Thank you, that's excellent. Valerie or Ted?
Yeah, so
yeah,
maybe quickly.
I think, go for it, Valerie.
Yeah, I was just saying, you will complete it. It's okay. Yeah, so every step for us is an opportunity and then the lesson as well at the same time. And the great question is about what do we left behind after our program, like when people implement programs on the ground, because the needs are still there. Maybe sometime we have programs for 5 years, and then the needs are not for 5 years. The needs on the community is now they're kind of fragile community. The needs is more than that, and it's really important to implement those kind of models on the ground that we kind of bring that mindset of empower the community and help the community to have those access for long. So over to you, Ted.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I think we're out of time, but Valerie, I really appreciate that answer. I'd like to just thank our presenters for sharing their time and their lessons and yes, even their failures. I'll turn it back over to Janina for closing. And of course, thank you to all our participants for joining as well.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you everyone so much for spending your time with us today. A special thank you to our presenters. As you'll see, there's a lot of really rich questions that we've received into the chat. With that being said, we will invite you now to go ahead and fill out these exit polls that will appear on your screen in just a few moments. And if you do have a moment to stay just a couple minutes extra, we do invite you to continue sharing questions and thoughts into this chat. Do share with us what was the most useful content of today, and then also what additional questions or comments do you have for our presenters. We will continue to keep this room open for you to engage, and with that, you'll see on the screen we do have some follow-up information, some email addresses that you can access if you have more questions, and have a great rest of your day no matter where your feet find you. Thank you, everyone.
Hadithi zilizosemwa na wazazi, muziki twaimba twacheza, ulitoka Afrika bwana, hatuendi kusoma kucheza, hatuendi shuleni kuimba. Nani yule atasema si ukweli? Muziki ni wetu muziki nzuri toka Afrika, mchana na jioni twakatika, utaukuta barabara ni nyumbani mali pote. Muziki waleta raha aona, muziki uponyeshwa magonjwa, sisi twausherea bila matatizo, joni kwetu mama. Sisi twausherea bila matatizo, joni kwetu Nala yeko asemumanda, sahau mashida ndugu, wenjoni tukatike, hizo shida zote zitapita. Yokandule kalaeza kubeta